3 mornings ago, I was walking with my dog when we were crossing over a part of the LA River. And as the basin of the river started to come into view, something caught my eye that looked like the collapsed body of a dog. This split-second recognition sent a shockwave through my body. I could feel it in my chest, in my neck, throughout my limbs and my extremities, all as an anxious kind of riveting and terrified tension. As quickly as I'd thought I'd seen a lifeless dog body, however, I realized that this was not in fact a dog, but a plastic carousel horse that had been unmoored from some children's supermarket coin-operated ride and had been, for some, I'm sure, terribly exciting late-night reason, tossed into the dry concrete bed from the sidewalk above. I thought of the intensity of this performance that had just taken place within me as we continued to walk, a performance provoked by this static object, something more like a sculpture than anything we'd typically associate with the moving things of a performance, which activated a set of intensities within me, a misrecognition that set off a chain of meanings that rippled throughout me much more quickly than I can think consciously. And it reminded me that our understanding of performance today, which allows me to understand my own immediate role as a spectator, as one of performer and audience in one, that this seems to potentially change everything. I'll be honest, though, and let you know that I was asked to present here just 3 days ago. The night before I took that walk by the river, in fact, as I was asked to fill in for one of our distinguished guests who had unfortunately had to back out, and I'm very happy to be here to fill in. I don't bring this up to make any apologies or justifications for not being wholly prepared or rehearsed, although my notes are beginning to sound a bit more refined than I had anticipated they would. I do mention this because I thought that rather than cramming through some new presentation or trying to pretend that I was incredibly prepared, that maybe the circumstances that brought me here, before you, on stage, right now, in its relative spontaneity, that this might allow us to have a slightly different relationship to this event for a moment. Perhaps to think about liveness, this liveness right now, its potential for an openness in the midst of the myriad performances of this exact space and time. So I wonder what happens if we think about what is performing right now. Are all of us, for example, performing right now? I myself performing as presenter, of course, but all of you as well performing as audience members, performing as ushers, performing as tech crew, performing as producers of the event. We are also all performing something together, myself as presenter and you as audience, all performing a singular convention, maintaining a traditional performer-audience relationship, which is in actuality a particular form of social organization that has a history and that we are all agreeing to, and at any moment we could choose to disrupt it and storm the stage. But by not doing so, we perform this convention, presumably because we're finding value in it at the moment, and hopefully that more so than because we're prisoners to it. There's also the performance of this architecture, how it moves all of us through it, holds us in these seats. And at the moment of a certain timing and a set of cues filters us down from the lobby where we wait for the show into the belly of the proper performance space to encounter some series of gestures, all while the architecture is performing itself as a larger cultural thing. An institution, the Red Cat, an organization of funds and minds and bodies organized around a purpose, which at the very least has to perform what it says it is. It has to perform the conventions of a proper theater, of a proper gallery, and can vary away from this as much as it likes, up to certain limits, before it starts to no longer be recognizable as that particular kind of institution. Like each of us in asserting our own identities and credentials, it too has to satisfy a minimum fidelity or competency to the things it claims to be, while at the same time we are all simultaneously pushing up against the limits that these competencies perform upon us. And in each of these limits, there exists a possibility, a traumatic possibility or a liberating possibility, or perhaps both, of becoming something else. There is also the threshold to this architecture, the line that separates this inside from its outside, that we should highlight. One might never know that literally 15 minutes walking distance from here is LA's Skid Row, where today there are growing numbers, estimates of 15 to 20,000 people living, and where a new strain of tuberculosis has recently been discovered and taken a number of people's lives. The daily maintenance of this threshold between there and here is performed through police, by business improvement security forces, and spatial patterns of gentrification long before the literal architecture threshold of this building has to do anything about it. But as a result, something so close is articulated as so far away, if not rendered entirely invisible to us here. What seems most powerful about performance to me today is the liveness that exists in all these instances of performance, the fragility of the moment in which something is taking place and in which that something is defined, confirmed, masqueraded, or revealed as an imposter. I mentioned an openness, an undeniable specificity that exists in every moment of the present, and this allows for an urgency that matches the urgency of our time, of our moment in history, in this world, in the country, in this city, in this theater. I think about where we see the word live appear and what it seems to announce. On the TV screen, for example, during a car chase, where it reads live camera feed in the corner of the screen, and it somehow shifts our perception of the present as the TV time of the car chase or an unraveling catastrophe becomes synchronous with our own living, breathing time. Or also where the quality of live is advertised on billboards for exotic dance clubs, on the storefront of a pet store, or announcing a special appearance of a celebrity or performer live and in person. Where in each case the quality of liveness means something extra special. In the flesh, the real deal, alive. Not only is it something more than a reproduction or representation, but it's an opportunity in which your live, present temporality and its will be the same, shared, experienced, in sync, and real time. I'd like to tell you about a performance that really shook me up a couple of months ago. A performance titled Turbulence, A Dance About the Economy by Keith Hennessy and a group of amazing collaborators that I saw in New York. Turbulence was a dance that tried to take up questions of the financial crisis in the forms of desperation it has generated in our world around us, and the backdrop of a decade of torture and war that it has been set against. They approached it with minimal stagecraft, house lights that were up throughout most of the show, bringing microphones throughout the audience to ask improvised questions, with dancers climbing and hanging from what looked like fragile structures on the ceiling, and constant failed attempts at making fierce bodily dance and spoken political analysis fit together. It was a piece that in its raw and undeniable immediacy held this tremendous vulnerability and urgency for me. A piece that was, of course, about itself, but also about the radical presence of something outside the room that it wouldn't let us ignore. This resonated with me in part because of the performance that I've been taking around the country and other parts of the world since 2010, a piece built up around time I spent in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina called Notes on the Emptying of a City, where I'd been invited to join a delegation of activists to look into what had happened at the Orleans Parish Prison, a city jail of nearly 8,000 people that the sheriff had refused to evacuate before the storm and predictably had flooded. The piece exists as a sort of dismantled film in which I read a narration script live, not so different from this, while queuing up images and video from my time there when I was performing with my camera. And in this performance, the live presence of myself has become completely integral to the piece itself. I couldn't take it away without destroying the piece. And by this I mean that, as I've performed it again and again, I've found that the material in each case is not only what I bring into the space, but also what the audience brings and what the context brings. And it is the liveness of my own presence as a performer, a witness, a political subject, as someone present who is accountable to the claims I make and to the audience who themselves are live with me and who I spend a lengthy Q&A with each time. It is through this insistence on actual presence where the urgency of the piece comes closest to matching the urgency of the subject matter, highlighting the demands of the present, the possibilities of acting, and the importance of not forgetting what is at the same time so close but so far. Where, as with Spaces of Skid Row, our social memory in the U.S. tries to ignore the ongoing effects of Hurricane Katrina and events like it. So, to the performance within a presentation. I was so affected by Keith Hennessy's piece that I had to start writing. And what came out of me the next day was a review that responded to what I had felt and continued to feel the next day, but it actually might not be so useful as a review per se, as it came to describe a performance that hadn't really existed. I'd like to finish by reading you my review of a performance that hasn't happened, from the imaginary set of possibilities that were catalyzed by Keith Hennessy's turbulence. There was a performance that turned out to be unexpectedly popular, or unexpectedly important, urgent as it may have been. So much so that more and more people came to be its audience. Since it seemed so important to people, it seemed important not to keep anyone out. And quickly, there were not enough seats. The theater had extra chairs that it laid out at the foot of the stage, and when they filled up, they found cushions as people's bodies began to bleed onto the stage and into what would have otherwise been the space of the performers. When the cushions were filled, people began to sit on jackets, on backpacks, on nothing but the stage floor itself, and onto each other. As the performance got underway, the waves of people did not wane. And when members of the performance troupe were asked what the theater staff should do, they were told no one should be turned away. So the ushers kept ushering, bringing people onto the stage as bodies crept up past the footlights and around by the wings and along the base of the backdrop, at which point the performers found themselves performing in the round, playing their choreographies and improvisations to viewers in every direction. Now the effect of the proscenium had been destroyed. The lighting had lost its focus on the performers alone, pooling instead onto viewers who suddenly appeared as worth of beholding as the performers themselves. Their limbs and torsos and the belongings they carried were illuminated as objects, props, and obstacles, while the sounds of their rustling, their shifting and rubbing up against one another, their commentary, their questions, their mumbles, gasps, and sighs filtered into the stage mics like a soundtrack, or the din of a mad city street filtering in through an open window. Still, the ushers kept ushering, helping newcomers to step ever carefully to a place to sit, the theater staff themselves making brief appearances in the light of this now contaminated performance. And soon, the audience had covered almost all of the stage, leaving so little room for the performance that it was no longer possible to distinguish between what was the space of the dance and what was the space of the spectator. All techniques of stagecraft having been assumed by the audience at this point, the space of the performance being filled by the unauthorized, and the performers becoming witnesses to those who were to have borne witness to them. The narration of this performance soon became one of urgencies, of the importances for which the people of this city continued to pour themselves into this space where we are to tell stories of ourselves. Something of a sculpture, something of a directorless performance, something of a mob, something of a rebellion. As night bugs draw themselves to a lantern, for 3 days and 4 nights, this performance was an endless drawing of people into the space of importance, in which every body was a story, every life a narrative, equally important and equally the point. Each story claiming the spotlight and grabbing for the mic, telling of their secrets and revealing a nudity that refused full identification, creeping their way toward the power of center stage and equally giving it up. Let me return finally to the profound qualities of this misrecognition that I had encountered with the dog that wasn't a dog in the LA River. Let me return to the tremendous power of the shifting of perceptions, the perceptions of ourselves and of others, that singular power that, like no other discipline, is supposed to be art's most central device. A device that has the ability to recognize and catalyze possibilities that lie latent and dormant within us as political subjects, as communities, possibilities that, without one another, we might be afraid to speak or acknowledge otherwise. And their power to address the urgency of things other than art itself, its markets, its institutions, its discourses, and its various narcissisms. We live in some amazing times, but we also live in some really fucked up times. Times in which all the powerful people in this room are needed to help imagine new possibilities and make new things happen. In this way, I'd like to share my understanding of performance as a laboratory for new forms of radicality, where in a time of continued technological and political alienation and abstraction of the immediate and the obscuring of political reality and impact, the immediacy of sharing time, space, and liveness becomes especially crucial. Drawing our attention to how we do and do not organize ourselves, a laboratory of resources to see how we can be different, ways that we can choose not to comply, not to buy in, and not to get in line. With this in mind, we can storm the stage anytime we want, but we shouldn't do it only in proper performance contexts and spaces alone. And I'm very grateful to today's context to be able to share these thoughts with you. Thank you.